Hello, hello, hello. It's a motherfucking Thursday. I I want to talk a lot about what life is kind of like. Uh, and how your self perception negatively impacts your own life. I've had a very bad self perception for a long time. And I think that for the most part, it kind of gets in the way of things that I want. I think my brain has this weird way of justifying things that I think. I think it has a weird way of expecting negativity, so that when negativity happens, it looks at me and says, see, you were right about this. And then that just reinforces the negative thinking process. I think that a lot of times when there's something that I want to do, I could put more effort into it, but because I expect failure, I kind of just give up. And I think anybody who watches these can see that in these videos. You can see that I don't really maintain a good appearance. I don't make sure that really anything is checked. I don't really... I constantly will say things like I don't really care how these videos turn out. And I'll tell myself things like, hey, these are just my internal monologues that I'm just kind of saying so that I can almost have like a video journal. And I think I say these things because I expect this channel to go nowhere. I worry about putting effort into something that will be a waste of my time. And I prepare for failure. And in doing so, I don't try. Because when I said that, there were a couple of things that I said that, you know, like you don't really understand your thoughts until you say it out loud. Because it's easier to give somebody advice than it is for you to receive advice. It's easier to give somebody else advice than for you to follow directions. And it's easier for you to point out somebody else's problems than to realize your own problems. And I think the hardest part of that is your brain interprets things. And because your brain interprets things, you just have a certain way of looking at situations, and your brain doesn't want to admit when it's wrong. It doesn't like being told that it's wrong, and it tries to find ways to basically say, like, well, I was right. I think that's why when people are shown that they're wrong, they normally backpedal because they're scared to be wrong. And they backpedal, or they kind of change up a little bit of what they were saying to basically say, oh, under this specific interpretation, if you look at it, squinting your eyes, on a third blood moon, when the stars are aligning, you know, then I am technically right. Under these very specific circumstances, maybe sort of probably not, though, because I'm just too scared to admit that I was wrong about something. And I think people kind of do that with their own personalities. You know, people get really defensive when you criticize them. And I don't realize how defensive I get until I say out loud and I start defending myself out loud, and I realize, like, why does it bother me? I realize very quickly what bothers me when people bring up criticisms about me. I think for a very long time I was in a position where I wasn't being criticized that much. So now that I'm in a position where nobody really cares, because I'm not an officer, I'm not a corporal, I'm not a deputy, and I'm not in a position where my knowledge makes that much of a difference, my position doesn't demand your respect. So people are more willing to offer me criticisms, and I think some of these criticisms were things that I needed to hear when I had authority. Uh, my fiance told me that my video yesterday was fairly negative, but it was very enlightening on how I looked at mental health issues. And for some reason, I got a little defensive when she said that, because I think deep down I know that I'm a very negative person. And you know, I had a moment where I was basically explaining how it's very hard for me to be positive, and it's like I know that I'm negative, but instead of just saying, yeah, I need to work on trying to be a little bit more positive, like it was just a big deal for me to just acknowledge that criticism. And I think that the reason why is because it is something that affects me very greatly. And I want to avoid dealing with it at all costs, because every time I try to deal with it, it doesn't work out, or I don't know what I'm doing, or I get told very general advice that I feel like isn't that helpful. Like when I went to therapy, and my therapist said, like, you need to try to force positive thoughts to have more positive outcomes. And that's true. But I think that when you have a negative thought cycle for so long, your brain is wired in such a way to where it's just a constant uphill battle, and it's almost like replacing pieces of yourself very slowly, and it feels helpless. It does. It feels hopeless. It feels helpless. And I think the reason why is because it's so much work that you don't realize the progress that you're making. And I think I have made some progress. I think I'm able to be a little bit more honest with myself. I think I'm able to confront my problems a little bit better. I think not being in a position where my image matters more than how I'm actually doing, is helping. And I think that it's remembering that it's a marathon, not a sprint, because I described it as like trying to change my negative thoughts into positive thoughts feels awful lot like putting food coloring in a lake. Like you see the food coloring where you put it, and then it just fizzles out for the rest of it. And it feels like you're constantly like pushing up this giant fucking boulder, and that you can't even just move it. But I think it's more. I think I just need to remind myself, and maybe it's also just looking at it in a more positive way, where I look at it and I say, like, it's like a pile of rocks, or it's like a pile of bricks. You know, who said building the wall? It was Will Smith, because people used to respect him before he punched Chris Rock in the face. But when he was respected, he had a couple of interesting quotes. He said, you know, like, I'm going to lay this brick as perfectly as I can, and I'm going to focus on each brick one at a time until I eventually have a wall. And I think what I'm doing is I'm working on my wall. And I can't tell the difference between a pile of bricks that just need to be moved one or two at a time and a giant boulder that you just can't move. And maybe I need to acknowledge that sometimes you're going to be doing a lot of little things here and there to eventually have a better outcome, instead of just focusing on the entire problem. And maybe it's okay for your brain to be a little bit tired, because you can't move bricks 24/7. And sometimes you can move bricks and your back gives out. And I think that when you're trying to work on your mental health constantly, it's just mentally exhausting. And when you're exhausted, you just say things that like I don't know why I'm trying this. I don't know why I'm doing this. I don't know if this is even resulting in anything, you know. And it's too early to be able to definitively say that. I've only worked on this stuff for like the past year. and it's correcting a decade and a half of negative thought patterns. And I can't, just like how 1 week won't do anything, a year's not really going to do too much. And to be honest, no, a year can only indicate small to meaningful changes, but ultimately you still be the same person. And trying to relate things to the ways that I understand it makes it a little bit easier too. I think that's the value in metaphors, is if you compare things to things that you understand, it makes sense. You know, if you go to the gym for a month or for a year, after a year, you could be a different person if you're working really hard. If it's at first, but you're still the same person for the most part. And to truly be unrecognizable from your prior self, unless if you just have all of this fat that you're losing, right? But to truly build like a ridiculous amount of muscle, it takes a long time. And people, I had a friend last night who he's tall and he's pretty skinny. I think he's like 6 foot fucking 5 or something. Like, this guy's like a giraffe. And he wants more muscles, but he's a dad. He has a full-time job. He has a kid now. He has a baby now. He's having trouble just making time to eat sometimes. And I told him, I said, like, you don't need to build muscle. You know that, right? He says, yeah, but I want muscle. And I was like, yeah. He's like, I don't like being skinny. I'm like, well, you don't like being skinny until you gain weight, and then you're a little bit fat, and then that becomes its own problem, and then it becomes a whole nother battle of you losing weight. He says, yeah, but you have like a lot of muscle. And I was thinking about it, and I was like, yeah, this is like years and years. Like, it's not just showing up to the gym. It's like years and years of me, like, working at it. And then I thought about it, and I said, like, well, my brain needs the same thing. Like, my brain needs years of me working at it, of me not giving up, but allowing myself the ability to make mistakes and forgiving myself when I make mistakes, and understanding that it's a 3 steps forward, 2 steps back kind of thing, and knowing that it's an exhausting process, and knowing that it takes time, and I have time, and that is something that I'm lucky about, because some people don't have that time. I decided to work on this stuff now because I was deathly afraid of being this miserable person in my 30s and in my 40s, and ending up as a lonely person, or ending up as somebody who's just jobless because he doesn't care about anything. And I think that I foresaw in my mind that was a path that I was going down. And I think I panicked. And I think that made me even more scared. And I think that fear drove me to saying, like, something needs to change. On top of the fact that instead of me just confronting my friends and family about it and telling them about it, it was a lot of small things that would come up on their radar, and things that would just make people think that I was an asshole. And so not addressing it and avoiding it only continuously ruined my image, and made it to where these bad moments that I had just added up in people's heads. And I think that the hardest part about this, and the part that I need to forgive myself the most, is that I could have started this journey a lot earlier. I could have worked on this when I was younger, and maybe it would have been a little bit easier, or maybe it would take a little bit less work now. Maybe it's just me wishing that I would have admitted to this stuff earlier, and I would have started earlier, so that I could be ahead a little bit more. I don't know. But it is exhaustive, and I have made improvements, and I need to acknowledge that, because if I don't acknowledge it, that's just another negative thing. And if I can't acknowledge the good things that I've done, then it doesn't matter how many good things I've done. And I have to acknowledge it. I have to I have to acknowledge it and not just think that everything is negative and not just think that everything is for naught. Even if it's something small, it contributes, it adds to the wall. Move everything a brick at a time. Clear out the rubble, a shovel or a handful at a time, and do that for long enough, and you'll have a wall, or you will have a clean area, or your brain will be better, and it'll be easier. It's like when in BoJack Horseman, the guy was running, and he wanted to try running, and he was running uphill, and he passes out and says, "Oh my God, this is awful. I can't do this." And the guy comes up to him and helps him up, and he's like, "How do you do this every day?" He says, "It's easy, but you have to do it every day, and that's the hard part."